Now understand on this, what did the court hold? Because they had a 3-word answer. Separate but equal. They basically said that as long as the facilities are equal between the races, and in this instance you had the same train cars with the same seats and the same windows and the same bathroom facilities, they said, you know what, it is perfectly legal to separate the races as long as the facilities that are being used are equal, hence separate but equal. And separate but equal was the standard of law from 1896 in Plessy all the way up until the 1950s with Brown versus Board of Education. So this was the case that basically set a half-century of American law dealing with segregation. Go ahead, Ethan.
The 13th Amendment was the Emancipation Proclamation. The 15th gave all people...
Well, be careful. The Emancipation Proclamation is a little bit different than the amendment, but the 13th Amendment ended slavery.
Okay.
Ended slavery, yes. And the 15th Amendment?
That gave all persons the right to vote, or restrict people from denying people the right to vote based off of race.
Gender. Gender?
No, that was a different
Not gender, that's a different one.
Race, color, and
Previous forms of, or previous, like, if you were enslaved or
like
not
from
before?
the slave was that, but I don't
Previous,
know.
like the slaves was like?
What's for the slave? but-
Previous
yeah.
condition of servitude. The 15th Amendment has got a video in there. Please make sure you take a good look at that video and make sure that you take a good look, in fact, at those voting rights tests. And you'll see it down here. 15th Amendment and voting rights tests. Congress, in the 15th Amendment, basically said that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And, you know, you caught yourself, Ethan. It didn't give people the right to vote, but it said why you couldn't deny somebody the right to vote. So then what did these southern states do?
Like poll tax. Military tests.
Well, they denied them for other reasons. Okay, so what was, poll tax, literacy test, grandfather clause. Go ahead.
The bar soap, the bubbles in the bar soap.
What about the bubbles on the bar soap?
If they could count how many bubbles the bar soap made,
Yeah.
they could vote.
Yes.
But if not, they couldn't vote.
Yeah, and why was that legal to ban somebody the right to vote because of the bubbles on the bar soap?
Because people like slaves, they couldn't count as
Yeah.
high, so.
So they weren't going to get it right. Of course, the people that gave you the bar soap didn't know how many bubbles were in there either. So, and it was former slaves, it was also poor whites. But why would it be legal to ban somebody from voting? Go ahead.
It's not explicitly mentioned in the 15th Amendment.
It's not about race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It's about the number of bubbles that were in the bar soap. The jelly bean test. How many jelly beans were in the jar? And you're right, people that weren't very well educated, whether they were poor whites or, for that matter, previous slaves, the idea is that they'd be denied because they didn't know how many jelly beans were in the jar. How'd the poll tax work? You mentioned that before, right?
Yeah, but I have a different question.
Okay.
Was Plessy versus Ferguson the one that you said was considered the worst case?
No. We'll get to that in just a minute, I promise. Well, what about the poll tax? Anybody remember? Go ahead.
You had to get a receipt. You had to hold
Oh,
up
I
that
remember
paper
now.
receipt.
Yeah, they set up poll taxes, and you would have to pay these well in advance of the election, first of all. And you'd have to hold on to these receipts in a number of instances. So even if you paid, but you still didn't have the receipt, then that would mean, in fact, that you weren't going to be allowed to vote. If you remember thinking about this too, you could, there was the receipt part of it. What if you had never paid the poll tax previously?
The cumulative poll tax.
Cumulative poll tax, how did that work?
You had to pay for every previous election you had missed.
So the basic idea was that the more times that you didn't vote, the less likely you were ever going to vote because you were going to have to pay all of the old poll taxes. And how much would the poll tax be roughly in today's dollars? Do you remember? 15, 20, in some places maybe depending upon how it translates, maybe up to $50. And I asked y'all at different points, would you pay this? So there were 2 or 3 things. One, a lot of people didn't have $1 or $2 to go pay the poll tax. 2, if they did have the money, there was a deadline. And if they missed the deadline, even if they had the money later, they weren't going to be allowed to vote. 3, if they made the deadline but they lost their receipt, even though they paid, they didn't have proof, so they weren't going to be allowed to vote. And then 4, the cumulative poll tax, which basically said you're going to have to pay for every election that you missed, which means if you had not voted in 4 or 5 elections, now you're not dealing with $1 or $2, you're dealing with $5 or $10, which is getting up to, you know, 75, 100, maybe more dollars in real time. Would you drop that kind of money to vote? I think a lot of people wouldn't. You mentioned grandfather clause. What was that?
That was if your grandfather voted, you could vote too. And
If grandfather voted, if your grandfather could vote prior to the end of the Civil War, basically, then you could vote too. And the basic gist of this was that there would have been a lot of, obviously, slaves where grandfathers would not have been allowed to vote, but there also would have been a lot of poor whites. And see, that's the thing. Understand, you know, they didn't just deny slaves or previous slaves or people under the previous condition of servitude, because if they did, then this would be based on race or color or previous condition of servitude. That's why it was important that they banned the poor whites. So now you fulfilled not dealing with race, color, and previous condition of servitude as long as you ban both groups. Both groups. So grandfather clause, poll tax, jelly bean test, soap bubble test, and don't forget the literacy test. Dula, go ahead.
You said the grandfather clause was your grandfather vote before the
Before the Civil War ended. Yeah, if your grandfather could vote before the Civil War ended, then it was legal for you to vote. Take a look at that video because it really goes through literacy tests, and the video with Selma deals with literacy tests too. That was the one with Oprah, and if you remember, asking not just the number of judges, but asking the names of all of the judges that were in Alabama. What other questions have y'all got from the terms right quick? ADA was Americans with Disabilities Act. Do y'all remember very much of what we said about ADA? Go ahead, Ryan.
you said something like you can't discriminate with people that have disabilities.
That's true, but there were some other things that
3 feet between each aisle.
the minimum aisle width is 3 feet. And I told you about that man that came into my old stores and put a yardstick on his wheelchair and would just break things and tell us that we weren't in compliance. ADA is really dealing, if you remember, with the idea of grab bars and ramps for buildings, grab bars in restrooms,
Oh,
testing centers. Go ahead.
you said like that's the reason why schools have elevators.
And I mentioned the elevators from the University of Wyoming to make sure that people could not only get to their classes, but the classes could be on any floor so that every person would be treated the same. And that's the thing. If there's a really good example of an historically disadvantaged group, Americans with disabilities would be that kind of group because they were largely forgotten about until the 1990s, you could argue, when the government finally passed that. That'll be a small part of the test, but it'll be there. Anything else that jumps out?
Sexual harassment.
You know, I don't know that we dealt a whole lot with sexual harassment, but this is what I'll say. And this is a really good way of kind of summing up the chapter. So let me make sure that you got this, because I know we talked about this. And I said this on a number of occasions. If I say something and I think it's okay, it doesn't mean that it's okay. If I say something and a majority of the class thinks it's okay, it doesn't mean it's okay. But the basic idea is that if I say something, I've got to consider how everybody is going to take it a little differently. And the trick is, whether you're talking about sexual harassment or political correctness, the bottom line is that if so much as one person feels like they've been harassed, or you've said something that maybe is a little bit off color or off tune, so to speak, well, the idea is that there might be something that would be actionable there. So keep that in mind, whether it's political correctness. And you remember the political correctness articles, right? Let me run back here and deal with a couple of these. Because, man, there were a frick load of articles up here. These political correctness articles, do you remember any of those? Go ahead.
The one from Delaware about like what not to say to some of your coworkers.
The faux pas pamphlet from the Delaware Department of Transportation. And what were some of the things that you weren't supposed to say?
I think one of them, like to a coworker, was like, "Want to go get some fried chicken or something?"
Not supposed to say to black coworkers, "Let me get you some fried chicken," or what's that, Abdul? Watermelons, yeah. Fried chicken or watermelons, if you remember. Remember anything else from that pamphlet?
Yeah, the beans.
The beans?
Yes. Like green beans. fried
The
chicken.
green beans.
Sounds like
Collard
green.
greens. She's
Yeah.
about collard
Okay,
greens.
that actually came from that Tiger Woods video, fried chicken and collard greens. You remember who the golfer was that said it? Fuzzy Zeller. Make sure that you're comfortable with these. But going back to Delaware, you're not supposed to ask black coworkers about fried chicken and watermelon. Go ahead.
I'm not supposed to ask Hispanics if they know any landscaping.
Yeah, can you help me with my landscaping? Can you recommend a good Mexican restaurant to Asians? Oh, you must be the new IT person. You remember these things now? Go back and make sure that you're comfortable with these, because there were a lot of them in there. Y'all already talked about the Michigan lady that ultimately got in some trouble because she requested a Christian roommate. Do you remember DOA? What state was that?
What did he say?
DOA.
What does that stand for?
Yeah. Dead on arrival. What state was that? Check that. Iowa passed DOA because they wanted to treat older folks better. They wanted to change, what was it? The Department of Elder Affairs to the Department of Aging, and DOA literally translates as dead on arrival for hospitals. So they were sending older folks to the DOA, which actually made it worse. You look at some of these in there, and there were 5 or 6 articles that were on the page. There was something in there about height. If you remember Little People of America, that was something that was in there. I mean, I tried to give you examples of as many groups getting upset as I could, and I think I actually did a pretty good job. Going back over to the videos right quick and looking at some of the links, because this really does overlap. Tiger, Fuzzy, and the collard greens is the one that y'all were talking about. Not green beans, collard greens.
Okay.
You notice up here, what was it that Joe Biden said? Go ahead.
Joe Biden said he was surprised to see like a black man that was educated and like clean and not ignorant, basically.
Okay, go ahead.
So that he was like articulate and like it was like a story.
Yeah, this is the first sort of mainstream African American who is bright and articulate and clean. I mean, that's a storybook, man. That's what Joe Biden said. And by themselves, those attributes aren't necessarily bad. But remember, there's certain things that you don't say. And the thing that really, I think bothered people the most was clean. But if you really read what he was saying, he's basically saying, look, the average African-American male is not articulate and bright and clean. I mean, it was a really awful thing. Of course, he recovered and became the vice president. Seinfeld and Native Americans, do you remember the things there that maybe, go ahead, do them.
It was like things that like you don't know are bad until like you're around the person that's like are bad.
Exactly. Do you remember what some of the things were that he said or that he did?
They were like, he said like normal like references to things that like.
Like what?
I don't know the exact. It was like 2 of them.
He was making noises.
Go ahead, you started it.
It's like a
Scalper.
Scalper for selling tickets. Reservation. He was talking about dinner reservations, but it's not the same thing. I think Indian giver was in there. That probably is the worst of the batch. He made a number of gestures with the statue, if you remember. You have a look on your face. I take a look at this, because all of these are really, really good examples of political incorrectness, maybe. Go ahead.
What state was DOA?
DOA was Iowa. DOA was Iowa. And there might be 1 or 2 other smallish ones in there. Oh yeah, do you remember the words that they banned?
Like
Oh, junk food. Any others? Birthdays got banned. Any others?
Halloween.
Dancing, Halloween, birthdays, junk food. Take a look at that one dealing with the New York testing, the New York schools testing. Go ahead.
I don't think you gave it to this time.
Well, if I didn't, it's a real quick one because it's like this big. You'll see it in there. It really isn't all that crazy. But on these, do you remember the NBA dress code?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
They said they didn't want the players wearing like things that weren't appropriate, like lots of jewelry and like baggy clothes and like saggy and stuff like that.
Make sure that you give me a good listing of some of the things that they banned in there, because it ran through and it was talking about caps cocked to the side, do-rags, headphones, chains with pendants, the approximate size and weight of a small child, baggy rumpled sweat. You get the idea, but make sure. The NBA, what's that? Sunglasses indoors, yes. The NBA was basically concerned about its image, and they imposed a dress code. And, you know, if they would have said, we're on a business